June 12, 1952, 11:43 p.m. A crane stalled above the pier as Bumpy Johnson opened the ledger, calm enough to let the harbor decide who remembered breathing. The pier smelled of salt and old rope. Wood creaked in slow complaints under the weight of men who had learned not to rush. Bumpy Johnson stood near the edge, not looking at the water, not watching the work. He held the ledger the way a man holds a verdict before reading it out loud. The book was plain, no stamp, no color, just weight. A crane groaned overhead, metal teeth locked around a crate that did not want to move. For a moment, it hung there, swaying. A guard shifted his feet beneath it, then froze. No one said a word. The crate steadied. The crane resumed. The guard exhaled like he had just been reminded of something private. Bumpy did not look up. He opened the ledger and let the page breathe. Ink sat thick in the columns, darker than the others. A shipment logged without ceremony. No flourish. No signature, just presence written as if it had always belonged there. Men nearby pretended to check cargo tags. One counted nails in a crate he had sealed an hour earlier. Another wiped his hands on his coat, though they were already clean. The ledger stayed open long enough for everyone to notice it without being invited. Bumpy's authority lived in stillness. He did not block anyone's path. He did not ask for names. He let the dock decide who felt seen. By morning, inspectors would walk this pier. They would not hurry. They never did. They would follow paper the way water follows grooves, and anything that resisted would be noticed. Everyone here understood that without being told. Deadlines did not need clocks when they arrived with habits. Bumpy turned one page. The sound was small, but it carried. The crane operator stopped chewing. A foreman straightened his cap without realizing he had touched it. The ledger now showed the line again, phantom weight written into existence. Bumpy rested the book against a piling and closed it halfway, enough to show restraint. He looked across the dock, eyes steady, not searching. If someone wanted to step forward, the space was there. If not, the night would remember who stayed still. He spoke once, low and clean. Paper travels farther than people. No one answered. Answers were not required yet. The tide shifted. Ropes tightened. The city kept its distance, listening without leaning in. The ledger remained where it was, neither hidden nor offered, doing its work by simply existing. By morning, the pier would ask a question of its own. The only uncertainty was this: when the ledger opened again, which name would refuse to be there? The night did not loosen its grip. It settled instead, pressing the pier flat and honest. Men drifted back to their routines with the careful patience of people who knew they were being measured by what they chose not to do. Bumpy Johnson stayed where he was. The ledger rested against the piling like it belonged to the dock more than the men did. No one touched it. No one asked whose hand had written the line. Questions were a form of ownership, and ownership was dangerous when paper was involved. A foreman passed close enough to smell the salt on Bumpy's coat. He slowed, then corrected himself, pretending the pause had never happened. Bumpy did not acknowledge him. Recognition was not a favor tonight. Across the pier, a pair of men spoke in half-sentences. Cargo numbers without verbs, directions without destinations. Their voices stayed low, as if volume itself might sign something by mistake. Bumpy watched the water now, not the surface but the way it met the posts. Patient, repetitive, certain. He understood systems that never raised their voice. The harbor had taught him that, so had Harlem. Someone cleared his throat behind him. Not loud, not timid, just enough to exist. Bumpy did not turn. "Everything square?" the man asked. The question landed and waited. It did not rush to be answered. Bumpy let it sit long enough to show it had been heard. Then he spoke without looking back. "Square things don't leave corners." The man said nothing after that. Silence accepted the correction. The crane finished its last lift for the night. Chains rattled once, then went still. The earlier danger faded into memory, but the memory stayed sharp. It reminded everyone that weight did not need intention to do harm. Bumpy picked up the ledger and opened it again. He traced the phantom line with his eyes, not his finger. Touching would have implied uncertainty. He knew exactly what he was seeing. No signature. That absence was louder than any name. He closed the book and tucked it under his arm. The gesture was small, controlled, ownership without possession. The ledger was not his, it belonged to the morning. A man stepped forward before he could stop himself, younger than the others, clean coat, careful shoes. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Bumpy turned then slowly, giving him the dignity of being fully seen. "You were going to say something," Bumpy said. The man swallowed, just making sure things were noted right. Bumpy held his gaze, calm, unmoved. "Notes don't make things right," he said. "They make them permanent." The man nodded once and stepped back, smaller than before. Bumpy walked the length of the pier, ledger still under his arm. He did not hurry. The dock adjusted around him, clearing space without instruction. Authority traveled ahead of his footsteps. At the end, he stopped and set the ledger down on a crate marked for inspection. Plain sight. No protection. Trust placed where fear could reach it. By morning, habits would take over. Procedures would speak. Paper would ask its quiet questions and wait for answers that could not be rushed or argued. Bumpy left the pier without looking back. The ledger stayed. When daylight opened it again, with the missing name still believed silence was enough. Morning did not arrive all at once. It eased in, thin and gray, like a decision made without enthusiasm. The dock accepted it the way it accepted everything else, without comment. Bumpy Johnson stood inside a small office off the pier, a room that smelled of damp paper and old coffee. The ledger lay on the desk, open, its spine tired, its pages obedient. It had not moved during the night. That mattered more than any guard. Men arrived one by one. No summons had been given. They came because places like this had a way of calling people who knew they were connected. Chairs scraped softly. Coats were folded and placed where they would not wrinkle. Nobody reached for the ledger. Bumpy remained standing. The room adjusted to him. Conversations shortened. Breathing slowed. The air learned restraint. Outside, a truck rolled past and stopped. Somewhere farther down the pier, a door slammed. The world continued, uninterested in what paper was about to decide. Bumpy looked at the ledger, then at the men. He did not count them. Counting suggested preparation. He did not need it. "There's a line here," he said, calm, even. "It doesn't belong to anybody who's spoken yet." No accusation lived in his voice, just placement. One man shifted his weight. Another sat straighter. A third checked his watch, then stopped himself halfway through the motion, embarrassed by the instinct. Time was not something anyone could manage today. Bumpy let the silence answer first. Silence was honest. It never lied to protect itself. A clerk cleared his throat. He was thin, careful, the kind of man who had learned early that survival came from neat handwriting and fewer opinions. He glanced at the ledger and then away from it, as if looking too long might pull him in. "I handle entries," the clerk said, not defensively, just as a fact, based on manifests. Bumpy nodded once, "And signatures." The clerk's mouth tightened, not enough to be obvious, enough to be real. "They usually come later," the clerk said, "after verification." Bumpy waited. Verification was a word people hid behind when they needed time. Time was not something the ledger had promised. He turned one page back, then forward again. The sound was clean, final. "This one didn't," Bumpy said, "come later." No one interrupted. Interruptions were for arguments. This was accounting. The clerk folded his hands together, fingers aligning carefully. "It was logged under instruction," he said. Bumpy's eyes lifted, not sharply, just enough to make the room lean in without realizing it. Whose? He asked. The clerk opened his mouth, then paused. That pause did not belong to him. It belonged to the ledger, to the pier, to the way habits collapsed when they were asked to stand on their own. He said a name, quiet, almost respectful. Bumpy did not react. Names were common, paper was specific. He closed the ledger halfway, leaving the phantom line visible. That name signs things, he said, often. No one disagreed. Agreement would have sounded like defense. Bumpy stepped back from the desk. He gave the room space to breathe, to consider how much weight it wanted to carry on its own. Signatures don't hide, he said. The words were flat, cold enough to be useful. The clerk looked at the ledger again, this time longer. His eyes stayed on the empty space where ink should have lived. Absence had a way of starring back. Outside, footsteps approached. Inspectors, not yet here but close enough to be imagined clearly. The internal deadline tightened without raising its voice. Bumpy watched the men, one by one, decide what they would remember when asked. The ledger waited. And the question settled into the room, steady and unavoidable. When the paper speaks, who will it say stood behind this line? The room did not empty, it thinned. One man left first, excusing himself without explanation. Another followed minutes later, adjusting his coat as if the morning had suddenly turned colder. Each departure felt measured, like numbers removed from a column to see what remained. Bumpy Johnson stayed still. The ledger lay open again, its spine creased where it always bent. The phantom line sat patient, untouched, as if it understood it had already done most of its work. The clerk remained. So did two others, men who knew how to stay when leaving would look worse. Bumpy pulled a chair back with one hand and sat. The movement was unhurried. Sitting did not reduce his authority. It sharpened it. From here, he could wait longer than anyone else in the room. You said the instruction came from above, Bumpy said. The clerk nodded, once no extra motion, yes. Above is a direction, Bumpy said, not a name. The clerk inhaled through his nose. He did not look at the other men. He had already learned that support was unreliable once paper entered the room. He told me it would be signed after, the clerk said, that it was cleaner that way. Bumpy leaned back slightly. The chair creaked. The sound landed harder than the sentence. Cleaner for who? He asked. The clerk hesitated, not because he did not know, but because saying it would change the shape of his day. He chose his words carefully, arranging them the way he arranged numbers. For the books, he said, at least that's what he said. Bumpy nodded again, slow. Books don't care about clean, he said. They care about matching. One of the other men shifted. He had been quiet too long for comfort. Sometimes things get delayed, he offered. Weather, timing. Bumpy turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. The look was calm, almost kind. Weather delays ships, Bumpy said, not handwriting. The man went still. Bumpy reached forward and closed the ledger fully. The sound was final without being loud. He did not move it away. He did not protect it. Closure was not concealment. You all understand what happens next, Bumpy said. Not because I say it, because mornings are predictable. No one argued. Predictability was the enemy of improvisation. The clerk swallowed. If the signature appears, he said, careful, before inspection. Bumpy's eyes stayed on him. Then it won't match the time, he said, and time leaves marks too. That ended the conversation. There was nothing left to adjust without admitting intent. Bumpy stood and picked up the ledger, holding it by the spine. He walked to the window and looked out toward the pier. Trucks lined up in neat obedience. Men moved with the confidence of routine. The city liked order when it could pretend it was natural. He turned back to the room. Do your work, he said, not a command, a verdict. The clerk nodded. The others did the same. They would not speak of this again unless paper forced them to. Bumpy placed the ledger back on the desk, exactly where it had been. Same angle, Same page marker. Consistency was a language inspectors trusted. He left the room without ceremony. Behind him, the clerk sat alone with the ledger. He did not reach for a pen. He did not close the book. He stared at the space where a name should have lived and understood something important. Some absences could not be repaired without being noticed. As footsteps echoed outside, the question remained, unspoken but sharp. When the inspectors ask how this line survived without a signature, who will still believe delay is an answer? The dock found its rhythm again, but it was thinner now. Movements were precise, voices measured. Men did their jobs the way people do when they know they may be asked to explain them later. Bumpy Johnson stood at the edge of the pier, hands empty. The ledger was not with him, but its weight followed. Objects did not need to be carried to stay present. Some learned that once and never forgot. A foreman approached, careful not to rush. He stopped a few steps away, close enough to be respectful, far enough to avoid familiarity. "Inspectors are on their way," the foreman said. Bumpy nodded. He already knew. Information traveled faster when it wanted to be believed. "Good," he said. That was all. The foreman lingered, uncertain whether he had been dismissed. Bumpy looked past him toward the water. The tide was higher now, pressing against the posts with quiet insistence. Pressure did not need drama to do its work. "Anything you want me to prepare?" the foreman asked. Bumpy considered the question. Preparation suggested control. Control suggested guilt. "Just keep things where they belong," he said. The foreman nodded and left, relief and worry sharing the same expression. Bumpy walked slowly along the pier. He passed men who straightened without realizing it. He passed others who pretended not to notice him at all. Both reactions were useful. Near the office, he paused. Through the window, he could see the clerk seated at the desk. The ledger lay open in front of him, unmoved. The clerk's hands rested flat on either side, as if the space between them might shift if touched. Bumpy watched for a moment, then turned away. Supervision was unnecessary now. The internal deadline had taken over. It did not shout. It simply waited, narrowing options the way walls narrow hallways. A truck backfired down the pier. The sound cracked sharp, then vanished. A few men flinched. No one laughed it off. Even harmless noise carried weight today. Bumpy stopped near a crate marked with inspection chalk. The letters were smudged, old, reused. Procedures recycled themselves. That was their strength. He thought of the phantom line in the ledger. Ink without commitment. Authority implied but never claimed. It had been logged as if inevitability itself had written it. Someone behind him spoke without meaning to. "If they don't find anything." The sentence ended before it could finish. Bumpy did not turn. "They will," he said. Not a threat, a statement of habit. Paper did not miss details. People missed them when they hoped hard enough. Footsteps approached from the far end of the pier. Measured, 2 sets. Inspectors close now. The deadline did not tighten, it arrived. Bumpy stepped aside, giving the path back to the dock itself. He did not need to be present for the next part. His influence had already settled into place. As the inspectors entered the office, Bumpy looked once more toward the water. The tide held steady, pressing without urgency. When the ledger opened again, it would not ask for explanations. It would ask for alignment. And the question, now unavoidable, waited in the air. When procedure meets absence, who absorbs the cost of pretending nothing happened? The inspectors did not announce themselves. They never did. They arrived the way habits arrive, quiet, confident, already trusted. Bumpy Johnson stood far enough away to be irrelevant and close enough to be unavoidable. He did not enter the office. He did not lean. He let the door frame hold its own weight. Inside, the clerk rose from his chair as the inspectors stepped in. Papers were exchanged. Names were spoken the way people speak them when they expect to hear them again. One inspector set his hat on the desk. The other opened a folder without hurry. The ledger lay open where it had been left. No one pointed to it. That was the moment that mattered. The clerk watched their hands move over forms that were familiar to him. Too familiar. He had filled versions of them for years. He knew where eyes landed when something did not belong. He also knew the sound a page made when it was turned for the wrong reason. The inspector reached the ledger last. He did not touch it at first. He read from where he stood, eyes narrowing just enough to show interest, not suspicion. Interest was worse. Interest meant time. "Shipment logged here," the inspector said, tapping the column lightly with a knuckle, not a finger. No receipt attached. The clerk nodded. Once he did not speak. "And no signature," the inspector added. Silence settled into the room and stayed. It was not dramatic, it was procedural. The other inspector leaned in, scanning dates, comparing lines. "Timing off," he said. "Logged before verification." The clerk's throat tightened. He kept his hands visible. Outside, Bumpy shifted his weight, that was all. A small movement, enough. The first inspector closed the ledger gently, then opened it again to the same page. He looked at the clerk. "Who authorized this entry?" The clerk thought of the name he had already spoken earlier, thought of how names traveled when written down, thought of how quickly distance collapsed once ink was involved. He answered. The inspector nodded, writing nothing. Writing came later. "And where's the signature?" the inspector asked. The clerk did not rush. He did not improvise. He said the only thing that fit the truth as it now stood. "It never came." The room accepted that sentence the way rooms accept gravity, without opinion. Outside, a gull cried and moved on. The dock did not pause for it. The inspectors exchanged a look, not alarm, recognition. They closed the ledger, this time marking the page with a thin slip of paper, temporary, official. "We'll follow up," one said. The clerk nodded again. This time the motion felt permanent. When the inspectors left, the office felt smaller. The ledger stayed on the desk, closed now, its presence complete. Bumpy did not enter. He did not need to. The consequence had already taken shape. Later, much later, a report would be filed without urgency. A review would be scheduled. A habit would change. One man would stop attaching his name to things he could not control. Bumpy walked the length of the pier once more, then left. No one stopped him. No one needed to. The phantom shipment would never be found, not because it moved, because it never existed. What remained was the absence where a signature should have been, and the quiet understanding that paper, once patient, eventually decides who is remembered for what they refuse to claim. The dock settled into daylight the way a body settles after a long night, careful, adjusted, changed in small ways that would not be explained later. Bumpy Johnson walked the perimeter without stopping. He did not check offices. He did not ask questions. Inspection had already done what it was meant to do. From here on, procedure would pretend it had always been heading in this direction. The ledger sat inside the office, closed now, a thin slip of paper marking its place like a quiet wound. No one hovered near it. Distance had become instinct. Men worked with a new precision. Forms were aligned twice before being handed over. Numbers were read aloud, then read again silently. Pens paused longer than usual before touching paper. A habit had shifted, and habits were harder to undo than mistakes. Bumpy paused near the water. The tide had pulled back slightly, leaving dark lines on the posts where pressure had been. Evidence without commentary. A clerk exited the office carrying a stack of reports. He stopped when he saw Bumpy, unsure whether stopping was permitted. Bumpy looked at him once, steady. "You did your job," Bumpy said. The clerk nodded, relief flickering and then disappearing just as quickly. Praise was not the point. Confirmation was. Inside, an inspector's voice carried faintly through the open window. Routine language. Nothing dramatic. That was how consequences preferred to arrive, dressed as normal. The ledger would move next. Not today, soon enough. It would be copied, referenced, cited without explanation. The missing signature would follow it wherever it went, an absence that required no escort. Bumpy adjusted his coat and turned away from the pier. He did not wait to see what happened next. Waiting suggested interest. Interest suggested involvement. As he walked, he thought of the phantom line. How easily it had been written, how impossible it had become to erase. Ink had failed to appear where it was expected, and that failure had spoken louder than any name. By the end of the day, no one would mention the shipment again. Mentioning it would invite questions, and questions had already been answered in the only way that mattered. Bumpy reached the street and did not look back. Behind him, the ledger remained incomplete, closed around a truth that would never be signed. And the quiet question lingered in the dock's routines, pressing without urgency. When authority is implied but never claimed, who carries the weight of what was left undone? Days passed without announcement. That was how the city confirmed things. Loud outcomes were for people who needed witnesses. This one did not. The ledger left the office in the back of a plain car, wrapped in brown paper, handled the way you handle something that belongs to a system, not a person. No one watched it go. Watching would have suggested hope. Bumpy Johnson heard about it later from a distance, without details. Details were unnecessary now. The absence had already done its work. On the pier, one habit changed. A clerk who used to sign quickly now waited. He read every line twice, sometimes 3 times. When his pen hovered, it stayed hovering until certainty arrived or the paper was set aside. He did not explain the change. He did not need to. No arrest followed. No confrontation. The man whose name had been spoken once learned to move differently. He stopped giving instructions that required trust. He stopped assuming paper would protect him. Authority thinned where it had once been implied. Bumpy walked Harlem that evening, unremarkable, unnoticed. The city did not thank him. It rarely did. Correction was not an event, it was maintenance. The ledger returned weeks later, its pages stamped, referenced, official. The phantom line remained, still unsigned, still unclaimed, still instructive. One line from that morning stayed with those who heard it. Ink is a promise. No one repeated it. Repetition would have turned it into advice, and advice invited argument. The pier worked, the city moved, lives adjusted without ceremony. What remained was simple and heavy. A shipment that never existed had changed how names were written. A missing signature had taught men where authority truly lived. In the end, nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. The concrete consequence was quiet. Paper slowed down. Pens hesitated. Absence became a warning. And the final question, left for anyone who read the ledger afterward, pressed without resolution. When a name refuses to sign, is it hiding from blame or admitting it was never earned?